Welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week, Sam breaks down the highest yield MCAT topics so you can score as high as possible on test day.
Hello and welcome to Prospective Doctors MCAT Basics with your host Sam Smith. The goal of this podcast is to cover the highest yield topics on the MCAT and provide you with some sort of insight into the questions that the MCAT really likes to ask. This podcast covers the digestive system. I talk first about the purpose of the digestive system, then I go into a little bit of anatomy. After that, I go into a whole lot of physiology, and then lastly, I talk about some of the regulation mechanisms of the digestive system, being first hormonal regulation and second nervous regulation. This material will show up on one of the four MCAT sections. That's the biochem section. And it's definitely an important organ system to know for the MCAT. Is it the most important organ system to know? Probably not, but it still will show up. Plus, I think it's a pretty interesting organ system, and at least I find it really interesting, and I hope you do as well, and I hope this podcast helps you in your studying. So in general, the function of the digestive system is to break down nutrients from your diet into parts that are small enough for your body to then absorb and use for energy growth, cell repair, and more. For example, when we digest protein, what we're doing is we're taking these really large proteins and we're breaking them down into individual amino acids or dipeptides or tripeptides, these really small bits that then can be absorbed into the body, into the bloodstream, and then distributed to the various cells throughout the body, where then these cells can essentially recycle and reuse these amino acids to produce big polypeptides or big proteins. Fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. Then those are transported through the lymphatic system, delivered to various tissues and used for energy. Carbohydrates are typically broken down into individual monosaccharides and then absorbed from there. And obviously, you know that monosaccharides such as glucose are used to produce ATP in the body, both directly and indirectly. If you haven't heard the ATP podcast, go listen to that. I get pretty deep into how ATP is produced, specifically from fatty acids and glucose. And I will say that it's a fairly common mistake to conflate the digestive system with the excretory system. So as I said, the role of the digestive system is to break down our food into small bits that the body can then absorb and use. The excretory system, on the other hand, functions to eliminate waste and excess compounds from the body. And the main organ that is involved in the excretory system is the kidney. And as I've stated previously, I love the kidney. I think the kidney is probably the most interesting organ. It helps filter the blood and helps maintain blood volume and therefore blood pressure. I did a whole podcast on renal physiology, and that's completely interesting. And I know I've probably said it for each organ system that it's the most interesting, but kidneys are really the most interesting. So anyways, to illustrate this further, let me introduce some of the main structures in each of these systems. So in the digestive system, you have the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and then you have the anus. And in the end, the digestive system produces a bowel movement. In the excretory system, you have the renal artery, kidney, ureter, bladder, urethra, and then all these work together to produce urine. And so really at the most basic level and kind of crudely put, you can think about the digestive system as producing fecal matter and the excretory system as producing urine. So all this is to say that the digestive system and the excretory system are two different systems, and I think they're kind of easily conflated because they both produce things that we excrete out of our bodies that are both gross, but I think it's important to just keep in mind these are two separate systems. And so before I go on and I talk about the anatomy of the digestive system, I want to talk about one last thing, and that is that there are several ways in which food is broken down in the digestive system. The first being chemical digestion, and the second being mechanical digestion. So chemical digestion is the breakdown of food via chemical reaction. And typically in the digestive system, this is going to be some sort of enzymatic reaction. And I'll talk about that in more detail as we go through the physiology of these different processes. Mechanical breakdown, on the other hand, is the breakdown of food via mechanical force. And so the easiest example of this to understand is chewing. So when you chew food, you are exerting a mechanical force on that food and you're breaking it down into smaller pieces. Therefore, that is mechanical digestion of that food. And so both of these processes, mechanical digestion and chemical digestion are occurring throughout the digestive system. And I'll get into what exactly this looks like in the stomach and what this looks like in the small intestine as I talk about physiology. But first, I want to talk about some of the anatomy of the digestive system, just so that you have an understanding of these different structures as I talk about them in the physiology section of this podcast. Because as you probably know, the MCAT is not really very anatomy heavy. In general, foods travel down the following path through the digestive system. First, they enter the mouth as you place them in your mouth, and they go down the esophagus, into the stomach, into the small intestine, into the large intestine, into the rectum, and then eventually they move out of the anus during a bowel movement. And the timing of this is pretty interesting to me. So I was reading an article that kind of puts all of this into perspective by giving the relative amount of time that food spends at each of these different structures in the digestive system. So food spends about 30 seconds in the mouth for chewing, which to me seems like a lot of time. Maybe I just eat fast. And then it takes about a second for the swallowing reflex to occur, which kicks the food from the mouth into the esophagus. Now the food travels as a bolus down the esophagus, and it travels down the esophagus via these rhythmic contractions of muscles present in the walls of the esophagus. And this takes about 5 or 8 seconds for the food to then travel the length of the esophagus into the stomach. Once the food is in the stomach, it spends about 2 to 5 hours there. And keep in mind that it is going to join quite a bit of other food that's been in the stomach. So it's joining essentially like a tank, your stomach, that already has a bunch of food in it. So it's not like this bolus remains intact and then 2 to 5 hours it just like slides into the small intestine. It's going to mix with all the other food. So I think the residence time of that stomach is about 2 to 5 hours. So just keep that in mind. So then once the food makes it into the small intestine, it spends about 3 to 5 hours in the small intestine, where then it makes its way into the large intestine. And now it spends a pretty long time in the large intestine, somewhere on average of about 36 hours. And then after this time, it is expelled as fecal matter. So as you can see, the majority of the time it takes to digest food is in the small and large intestines. And you'll see why that is when I talk about the processes that are occurring in the large and small intestines. And in addition to these different structures that I've talked about, the mouth, esophagus, stomach, small and large intestine, and rectum, there are several other structures that are important in the digestive system. There's 3 in particular that I want to introduce. One being the liver, and the liver makes bile that helps in the digestion of fats. The second being the gallbladder, which stores and concentrates the bile that's made by the liver. And the third being the pancreas, which makes a bunch of digestive enzymes, which are then secreted into the small intestine that helps us digest different types of food. So I want to take 3 of the most important structures in the digestive system and break down their anatomy a little bit more. That's going to be the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. 1. The stomach. The stomach is shaped kind of like a bagpipe. If you've ever seen a bagpipe, to me they look very similar. And at maximum, and depending upon a human size, the stomach can hold about 4 liters of food, which comes out to roughly a gallon of food. And that's actually a lot if you think about it. Think about eating your dinner and then taking your dinner and just chewing it and spitting it into an empty milk gallon, right? That would be approximately how much your stomach can hold, and that seems like a lot, and I'm going to check that real fast because that seems like too much. That number of a gallon looks to be about right. I mean, that is coming from a textbook called Invitation to Biology 5th edition, which was published in 1994. So next time you're wondering how much you can eat, just imagine taking your plate of food and chewing it and spitting it in a gallon jug, and then once that jug is full, that's about the capacity of your stomach. Kind of gross. All right, so back to anatomy. The stomach is divided into 4 regions: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. The cardia is where the esophagus connects to the stomach and where the food enters. The fundus is the top kind of dome-shaped part of the stomach. The body of the stomach is kind of like the main part of the stomach, hence the label body. And then the pylorus is the bottom of the stomach where it connects to the small intestine. And the last thing I'll say about the stomach is that the inner wall of the stomach contains smooth muscle, which is very important for the stomach's ability to churn food, which kind of jostles it around in the stomach and is important for mechanical digestion of food. 2. The small intestine. The small intestine is called the small intestine because its diameter is much smaller than the large intestine. So for instance, the diameter of the small intestine is about 1 inch, whereas the diameter of the large intestine is about 3 times that, or 3 inches. And despite its name, the small intestine is actually a lot longer than the large intestine. So for instance, the small intestine is about 20 feet long. Of course, that depends upon the size of the human and many other factors. But on average, the small intestine is about 20 feet long, whereas the large intestine is about 5 feet long. And the small intestines are the coiled or kind of packed looking part of the intestines. And it's probably what you think of when you hear the word intestine. And the small intestine is broken down into 3 segments. And in order, they are the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum is the first and shortest segment of the small intestine and is directly connected to the stomach. The jejunum is the middle segment of the small intestine and is called the jejunum because in Latin it means empty and was supposedly named so because the ancient Greeks noticed that at death it was always almost empty. And last, the ileum is the largest as well as the last segment of the small intestine. The last thing I'll say about the small intestine, and this actually goes for the large intestine as well, is that there are a type of cell that line the intestine that are absorptive cells, and they are called enterocytes. And you'll hear a lot more about enterocytes when I talk about absorption, but just know for now that there's a specific type of epithelial cell that lines the digestive tract, especially the small and large intestine, called an enterocyte. It's an important cell for absorption of nutrients. 3. The large intestine. The large intestine frames the small intestine like a wood frame around a photo. If you look at the abdominal cavity, you'll notice that the small intestine looks like this kind of packed, squiggly portion of the intestines, and then the large intestine creates almost like a box around it. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, just go look at a photo on Google or something like that. And as I said earlier, the large intestine is so-called the large intestine because the diameter is about 3 times that of the small intestine. And the large intestine is subdivided into 4 regions. And in order, they are the cecum, the colon, the rectum, and the anus. Further, the largest segment of the large intestine, which is the colon, is broken down into 4 parts. That is the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and the sigmoid colon. As material enters the cecum from the ileum, which is the junction essentially between the small intestine and the large intestine, it moves up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, and into the sigmoid colon. And then from there it goes into the rectum and eventually is expelled. All right, the last thing in terms of anatomy I want to talk about here are the various sphincters that are in the digestive system. If you're not familiar with a sphincter is a ring of muscle surrounding and serving to guard or close an opening or tube. One way to see how a sphincter works is to take your hand and make like a circle with your hand, or make an O. And now if you squeeze your fist together, you'll see that that circle now closes. And that's kind of like a sphincter contracting, right? That shuts the opening between 2 different compartments. So in this case, or I guess in these cases, I'm going to talk about sphincters that, for instance, separate the esophagus from the stomach. And so when these sphincters contract, like your hand, making a fist, and it closes that opening. Now when they relax, it's like creating an O again with your hand, and that opens up transport between those 2 compartments. So there's 6 sphincters that are located throughout the digestive system that all play important roles. The first is the upper esophageal sphincter, and it is located at the start of the esophagus, and it prevents food from entering into our respiratory tract. And because of its location, it also plays an important role in vomiting. The next sphincter is called the lower esophageal sphincter and is located at the bottom of the esophagus. And it allows food to pass from the esophagus into the stomach and plays a very, very important role in preventing stomach acid from essentially splashing up and entering into the esophagus from the stomach. And failure in this sphincter can lead to a painful disorder known as gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. The third sphincter is known as the pyloric sphincter, and it is located between the stomach and the duodenum, and it allows partially digested food to pass from the stomach into the small intestine, specifically into the first segment of the small intestine, which is the duodenum. The fourth sphincter is called the Sphincter of Od, and it is located where the bile duct and the pancreatic duct connect to the duodenum. And this allows bile from the gallbladder and pancreatic juice, which contains important digestive enzymes, to enter the duodenum. The fifth sphincter is the Iliocecal Sphincter, and it separates the small and large intestine and controls the movement of material from the small intestine to the large intestine. Then lastly, we have the sixth sphincter, which is the anal sphincter, and it is located in the rectum, and it controls the evacuation of stool from the rectum. And that's just a fancy way of saying it controls bowel movements. And so overall, sphincters are very important for controlling the flow of material from one part of the digestive system to another. All right, so that's a little bit on the anatomy of the digestive system. And again, it's important to understand some of the anatomy so then you can understand the physiology, which is really kind of the important stuff to understand for the MCAT and the topic of the next segment of this podcast. This next part of the podcast will cover physiology of the digestive system. Essentially, I will describe kind of what's going on within each of these structures that I just talked about and how they aid in digestion and absorption of different nutrients. And to me, this is the actual interesting stuff, not just describing the anatomy like I just did. And ironically, I think that this stuff honestly might take away your appetite. The digestive system is kind of gross. You'll see as I talk about chyme and, the chyme being squirted into the small intestine through the pyloric sphincter, and then obviously bowel movements. So it's kind of gross stuff, but also interesting. And so let's talk about the physiology in terms of the path that food would take in the digestive system, starting with the mouth. To put this in perspective, let's say that you're eating baba ganoush. If you've never had baba ganoush, it's basically eggplant hummus. You dip pita chips in it, it's delicious. Definitely better than real hummus. Also a very fun word to say, baba ganoush. And let's say that you're eating this baba ganoush with a pita chip. So what you're doing is you are dipping that pita chip in the baba ganoush and you're sticking it in your mouth. Now what you're doing at the most basic level is you're putting carbs from the pita, fat from the olive oil in the baba ganoush, and also protein from the tahini, that is sesame seed paste that's in the baba ganoush. You're putting all those components in your mouth and you're swallowing. But before all that occurs, your digestive system is actually starting to kick into gear. In other words, digestion actually starts before you put baba ganoush in your mouth. And what is happening is that upon smelling, seeing, or maybe even hearing this baba ganoush being prepared, you begin to salivate and your stomach and liver actually begin to prepare to digest this food. And so, this happens in a bunch of different ways, and I don't think it's important to understand kind of these preparatory secretions that occur. I'm going to talk in a bit about saliva because I think it's important to know what saliva is made up of and what it does. But just know that upon seeing, smelling, and hearing this food being prepared, your digestive organs start to begin to prepare for that food to be delivered to them. All right, so now back to putting this stuff in your mouth. So again, while it's being made, prepared, you smell it, you start to salivate. And salivation is just a term that means to produce saliva. And saliva is produced by glands in the mouth called salivary glands. And there's a few different salivary glands, the main one being the parotid gland. And there's a few different parotid glands. They're on either side of the mouth in front of both ears. And when you think about salivating or eating something sour, you can almost kind of feel where those glands are, if that makes sense. I don't know if you've felt that before. But the composition of saliva is mostly water. So it's about 99% water. But importantly, it contains enzymes. It contains a protein called mucin. It contains electrolytes, immunoglobulins, and nitrogenous compounds like urea and ammonia. And according to a review paper called Science Behind Human Saliva in the Journal of Natural Science Biology and Medicine by Manjul Tiwari, says that saliva serves many purposes, including lubricating and binding. And it says that the mucus in saliva is extremely effective in binding masticated food or chewed up food into a slippery bolus that slides easily through the esophagus without inflicting damage to the mucosa in the esophagus. Saliva also plays an important role in solubilizing dry food. In order for food to be tasted, the molecules in this food must be solubilized, so it helps us taste food. Next, saliva plays an important role in helping us maintain our oral hygiene. So the oral cavity is almost constantly being flushed with saliva, which carries away food debris and keeps the mouth relatively clean. As well as saliva also contains lysozyme, which is an enzyme that helps lyse bacteria and prevents the overgrowth of oral microbial populations in the mouth. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, saliva serves to initiate the digestion of starch. So saliva contains an enzyme known as an amylase, and what an amylase does is it breaks down starch. So starch, if you don't know, is a glucose polymer. It's a bunch of polymers, or it's a bunch of glucose monomers all attached to each other. And what this enzyme does is it hydrolyzes alpha-1,4 glycosidic linkages to then produce disaccharides and trisaccharides of glucose. And what happens then is that these di and trisaccharides later on in the digestive system are further broken down into individual glucose molecules so that they can then be absorbed and used by cells in the body. So overall, salivary amylase takes these starch molecules and it breaks them down into di and trisaccharides, which are these 2 and 3 unit carbohydrate molecules. So again, and briefly to summarize that, the 4 main functions of saliva, according to this article, are in lubricating and binding food, solubilization of dry food, maintaining our oral hygiene, and initiating starch digestion. Another thing I mentioned about saliva is that it contains this protein called a mucin protein. And this is a really interesting, important protein. It acts as a natural antibiotic and a natural antiviral. So according to this paper that I was reading about this, it said that, quote, salivary mucins are able to limit viral infection of T cells in the case of HIV/AIDS. They are able to limit the fungal infection in Candidus and able to inhibit surface attachment of cavity-forming bacteria, end quote. So that's pretty sweet. This small little protein in saliva can have all this antibiotic, antiviral activity. So when you hear of this mucin protein, just think of it as a natural pathogen-fighting protein. All right, so back to the baba ganoush. So again, before you even put this food in your mouth, you're going to start salivating. And now when you place that pita chip and baba ganoush in your mouth, the enzymes in the starch, the amylase, is going to start to break down the starch in the pita chip. So that's one way that the digestion is starting in your mouth. There is another way, and an even more important way, that the digestive process is initiated in the mouth, and that's in chewing. So when you chew, you are mechanically breaking down the food. Basically, you're just breaking the food down into smaller bits, which increases the surface area, making it easier for some of these chemical digestion processes to happen later on in the digestive system. So overall in the mouth, you have both chemical digestion and mechanical digestion. The chemical digestion begins in your mouth with the secretion of amylase in the saliva. That's going to start breaking down starch. And then obviously as you chew, you're going to mechanically start to break down your food. And then as you swallow this baba ganoush and pita chip that is now kind of this mush after you've chewed it, as you swallow, the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes momentarily, and this partially chewed, partially digested food now slides down into the esophagus through this sphincter. And it is actually moved down the esophagus by a type of muscle contraction known as peristalsis. And peristalsis is an important thing to understand. It is essentially wave-like muscular contractions or movements that push the contents of a canal forward. So kind of think about this as like squeezing the last bit of toothpaste from a toothpaste tube, right? How do you do that? Well, you're going to kind of squeeze at the very, very top of the tube and pull down and force all of that out. And what you're doing is you're essentially creating a force that's a wave-like motion, right? You're pulling down all at one time in one wave, and you're forcing the toothpaste out of that tube. So you're creating kind of bulk movement of toothpaste from, the very top of that tube all the way through to the end of the tube where it comes out. And so that's actually how food and digested food travels through the digestive system, specifically in the intestines and also in the esophagus. And that is known as peristalsis. All right, so peristalsis has forced this chewed up, a little bit digested baba ganoush pita chip mixture down the esophagus. And what happens when it reaches the lower esophageal sphincter is that this sphincter relaxes and allows this food to then enter the stomach. And of course, this sphincter closes up quite quickly because you don't want to get those gastric juices that are in the stomach up in the esophagus. That's what's known as acid reflux, and it hurts. If you've ever had experience drinking 8 or 10 cups of coffee and you're studying for a test, you'll know that after a while, you kind of get some of these acid reflux symptoms, and it is not fun, and it really does not feel good. So that's just an aside. Excess caffeine or over intake of caffeine can cause acid reflux or GERD-like symptoms.
Thanks for checking out the Prospective Doctor MCAT Basics podcast. Sam's doing a killer job taking you through the most important MCAT topics, but what if you need a little extra help? How does a 5, 10, or even 15-point increase in your score sound? Imagine how your chances at admission could increase. Med School Coach's MCAT tutoring can get you there. With the most rigorous selection process of any tutoring company, we see amazing results. We deconstruct each student, find a plan that is going to work, and help execute it. That's why our students add an average 12 points to their score. Completely physician-run and operated, and focusing on nothing but medicine. It's no wonder over 10,000 past students have trusted Med School Coach to get them through the MCAT and into medical school. Check out medschoolcoach.com today and mention code PODCAST for 5% off.
All right, so now this baba ganoush and pita chip, the carbs and fats and proteins that are in these have made their way into the stomach. And now I want to get into what exactly is going to happen to this food once it makes it into the stomach. So overall, the stomach is going to process the food that comes into it into chyme, which is a thick, semi-fluid mass of mostly digested food, which is then released into the small intestine. And the stomach contains an acidic solution known as gastric juice, which again, we don't want to go up into the esophagus. It hurts. And this gastric juice has several components. So first of all, it is very acidic. It has a pH between 1.5 and 3.5. And epithelial cells in the stomach called parietal cells actually secrete hydrochloric acid, which helps maintain this low pH. Another component of this gastric juice is an enzyme called pepsin. And so chief cells in the mucosal layer of the stomach lining secrete the proenzyme pepsinogen, and this proenzyme becomes active at a low pH and becomes pepsin. And so again, the environment in the stomach is at a low pH, in this gastric juice is at a low pH. And so once this pepsinogen becomes active and becomes pepsin, it has protease activity. And so this enzyme breaks down proteins by hydrolyzing peptide bonds. Another enzyme is also present in the gastric juice, and that is gastric lipase. And so lipase is an enzyme that hydrolyzes ester bonds of triglycerides to produce 2 fatty acids and a diacylglycerol. And gastric lipase is secreted also by chief cells. So overall, the 3 kind of main components of gastric juice are this low pH, the pepsin enzyme that breaks down proteins, and the lipase enzyme that breaks down fats. And so based upon the components and the makeup of this gastric juice, it has a few different functions. So first of all, this acidic environment that is created by the hydrochloric acid in the stomach can inactivate infectious microorganisms. This would be like in case the baba ganoush sat out too long and was somehow exposed to bacteria that started growing in it, which hopefully wouldn't happen. But this acidic environment also plays an important role in denaturing proteins. The pepsin, as I said, breaks down proteins into amino acids, and gastric lipase starts to break down some of these fats. And so this is chemical digestion. And in addition to this chemical digestion, there is actually some mechanical digestion that's going on. So the muscles in the stomach are constantly churning the contents of the stomach, which is called chyme. And this churning actually helps break down the food via mechanical digestion. So keep that in mind. In the stomach, you have chemical digestion by these enzymes in the low pH, and you have mechanical digestion by the churning of the contents of the stomach by the muscles in the stomach. So that covers how food is broken down in the stomach, but what about absorption? Is any of this food that's getting broken down, any of the fats, protein, carbohydrates, is any of that being absorbed in the stomach? The answer to that question is not really. Not much absorption of nutrients occurs in the stomach. There are some exceptions like alcohol and some drugs that are actually absorbed in the stomach, but for the sake of these nutrients in the baba ganoush and the pita chip, not much of those are getting absorbed in the stomach. The last thing I want to talk about here is how the stomach protects itself from this low pH acidic environment. So when I was talking about the gastric juice and how it has a low pH, you might have been wondering, okay, how does this just not really hurt the stomach? Why does this not just burn a hole in the stomach? And the answer to that is that there are epithelial cells in the stomach called goblet cells that produce a bicarbonate-rich mucus that protects the stomach from self-digestion. And essentially what this bicarbonate is going to do is it's just going to neutralize the gastric acid juice. So bicarbonate is a base. Obviously, gastric acid is an acid because of the hydrochloric acid. So you're going to have an acid-base reaction where you neutralize this gastric acid, and it's going to occur very locally, right? Because it's a mucus that contains this bicarbonate. So along that mucus, you're going to have a neutral pH because you're going to have this bicarbonate, hydrochloric acid-base reaction, and that is what's going to protect the epithelial cells of the stomach from this low pH. So overall, the stomach uses mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. In terms of mechanical digestion, it is constantly churning the food in the stomach. And then in terms of chemical digestion, you have gastric lipase and pepsin, and also a very low pH in the gastric juice, which denatures proteins. And in terms of absorption, not much absorption of nutrients occurs in the stomach. All right, so now our pita chip and our baba ganoush have both undergone digestion in the stomach, and they're now chyme. And now the pyloric sphincter opens up, and it allows some of this chyme to flow into the small intestine. And before I move on to small intestine physiology, I will mention that this pyloric sphincter controls the rate at which chyme enters into the small intestine. So, for instance, after or during a meal, the sphincter will close so that the food can enter the stomach and properly be digested into chyme before that pyloric sphincter opens and allows it to go into the small intestine. So just keep that in mind. All right, so let's talk now about the small intestine. So carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids are all digested and absorbed in the small intestine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down what's going on in the small intestine by these different nutrient classes. So I'll talk about what's going on with carbohydrates, what's going on with proteins, and what's going on with lipids. So let's start with my favorite macronutrient, and probably your favorite macronutrient, the carbohydrate. As I said earlier, in the saliva, there's an enzyme called amylase, which breaks down starches, and it produces tri and disaccharides. And in order for these carbohydrates to be absorbed, they need to be broken down into monosaccharides. In other words, you need to take di and trisaccharides and convert them into monosaccharides. And this is accomplished by brush border enzymes in the small intestine. Examples of these brush border enzymes include sucrase, isomaltase, and lactase. And so these brush border enzymes are actually anchored to brush border cells that line the small intestine. And I kind of like to imagine them like a chain chomp from Mario Kart. If you've ever played that, they're like these chomping kind of like black balls that are attached by a chain to, I don't even know what they're anchored to, but in the case of a brush border enzyme, it's the head of these chain chomps is essentially the enzyme, and then they're linked back to the cell. So they can break down these carbohydrates as they pass by in the lumen of the small intestine, but these enzymes don't just float away like with the digested food material that is in the small intestine because they're anchored back to these brush border cells. Now, in terms of absorption of these carbohydrates, as I said, once they're broken down into monosaccharides, they can be absorbed. And so this occurs mostly in the jejunum, but it also occurs in the duodenum and the ileum. And essentially how this transport takes place is that you have these transporters that are on the apical membrane of the enterocyte. And remember, the enterocyte are just the epithelial cells of the intestine. And so you have these transporters on the membrane, and these transporters are specific for different types of monosaccharides, and they can transport monosaccharides from the lumen of the small intestine into these enterocytes through the apical membrane. And then once these compounds enter into the enterocyte, then it can make its way into circulation where it can be distributed to the different cells in the body. So to briefly summarize what happens to carbohydrates in the small intestine, they are first broken down into monosaccharides by brush border enzymes. And then from there, they can be absorbed through transporters that are on the apical membrane of the enterocyte. Next, let's talk about what happens to proteins in the small intestine. So protein digestion starts in the stomach, where we have pepsin. Pepsin hydrolyzes peptide bonds. And it's important to note that the pancreas actually secretes several proteases that make their way into the small intestine. So the pancreas secretes trypsin, chymotrypsin, elastase, and carboxypeptidase A and B. And these cleave proteins into amino acids, tripeptides, dipeptides, and oligopeptides. So basically these short peptide segments. And pancreas secretions containing these enzymes drain into the duodenum. So this digestion from these enzymes, from these pancreatic enzymes, their proteases, is occurring throughout the length of the small intestine. So as I said, protein digestion yields free amino acids, dipeptides, tripeptides, and oligopeptides. So each of these different peptides is absorbed through a different transporter. So for instance, dipeptides and tripeptides are transported via the PEP1 transporter, which requires a hydrogen ion gradient. And again, these transporters are in the apical membrane of the enterocyte. On the other hand, free amino acids are transported through several different transporters on the apical membrane of the enterocyte. Things like carrier-mediated active transport proteins, facilitated diffusion transport proteins, and so forth. And I will mention lastly here that most of this absorption, like absorption of carbohydrates, occurs in the jejunum. Next, let's talk about what happens to fats in the small intestine. So fat digestion begins in the stomach, where we have gastric lipase, which breaks down triglycerides into 2 fatty acids and a diacylglycerol. Now, lipase is also present in pancreatic secretions, and this is called pancreatic lipase. And there are multiple different kinds of lipases that are in these pancreatic secretions, things like colipase, lipase, phospholipase A2, and cholesterol ester hydrolase. And again, pancreatic secretions enter into the small intestine at the duodenum. And essentially what these enzymes are going to do is they're going to continue to break down different types of fat molecules, triglycerol into 3 fatty acids and a glycerol. They'll break down phospholipids so that you can digest the fatty acid tails of some of these phospholipids. They digest a lot of these different fats. And the interesting thing to me is how these different fat molecules are absorbed. It's a whole different system than carbohydrates and proteins because those are fairly similar in how the digestive system absorbs them. So in order for fat to be effectively digested and absorbed, it must be emulsified. So emulsification is just a process of dispersing one liquid into another immiscible liquid. In other words, you want this fat to disperse in the watery chyme solution in the small intestine, right? Because water, the chyme, which is pretty watery, and the fat don't really mix. It's like trying to mix oil and water. It's not really going to happen. And so you need to be able to emulsify that fat. And how does that happen? Well, it happens through bile. And basically, bile contains these bile salts that can associate with fat and then form micelles. And what ends up happening is you get a bunch of these little micelles that are soluble in water. And so now you have these fats that are contained in these little micelle units that are spread throughout this watery chyme. And now the bile, along with the bile salts in the bile, have actually emulsified the fat in the small intestine. And now these micelles are actually able to fuse with the plasma membranes of the enterocytes and deliver whatever fats they have inside of them. And once inside the cell, you're actually going backwards, which this is kind of weird to me and kind of interesting, but you're actually going to produce, or the cell is going to produce triglycerides. So it's going to take free fatty acids and glycerol, and it's going to recombine them to make triglycerides. And then those triglycerides, along with phospholipids and cholesterol that you may have eaten, are going to come together to form chylomicrons. And these are just large lipoproteins like LDL and HDL, only bigger. And it's actually more like LDL. It's like a bigger LDL particle is what you can imagine it is. What happens then is these chylomicrons exit the enterocyte via exocytosis, and they make their way into the lymphatic system through a lacteal. So in short, fatty acids are emulsified by bile, and more specifically bile salts in the bile. Then they are transported into the cell. From there, the glycerol and free fatty acids are converted back to triglycerides, and then they are combined along with phospholipids and cholesterol into chylomicron particles. And then these chyloren particles are transported into the lymphatic system, where eventually they distribute fats, cholesterol, phospholipids to cells in the body. And I could do a whole podcast on the lymphatic system, and maybe I will. Okay, so that's how the main macronutrients are digested and absorbed in the small intestine. There are other nutrients that are absorbed in the small intestine. So for instance, vitamins are mostly absorbed in the jejunum. Vitamin B12 is absorbed in the terminal ileum, so at the very end of the small intestine. Electrolytes are mostly absorbed in the jejunum, and then water is absorbed throughout the small intestine. Overall, the bulk of the absorption in the digestive system occurs in the small intestine, as well as some of the digestion of the different nutrients that we eat. Last but not least, I want to talk about what occurs in the large intestine. By the time the baba ganoush and pita chip reaches the large intestine, more than 90% of the nutrients that are in it, the fats, the carbohydrates, and the protein have been absorbed by the small intestine. So really, you can think of the large intestine as just doing some cleanup absorption. The large intestine has three primary functions. 1, to absorb water and electrolytes. 2, to produce and absorb vitamins. And 3, in forming and moving feces towards the rectum for elimination. So let's talk about each of these. So first, as I said, water and electrolytes are absorbed in the large intestine. So water is absorbed via osmosis, and electrolytes are absorbed in the colon. So sodium, for instance, is absorbed via a sodium channel in the colon, and also potassium and chloride are two ions that are also absorbed in the colon. And 2, I said that another main function of the large intestine is in producing and absorbing vitamins. So the colon is home to many bacteria, and these bacteria can metabolize compounds that are still left in the GI tract and synthesize vitamins and other important molecules that can then be absorbed in the colon and used by us and by our cells. So for example, one compound that bacteria can metabolize but that we cannot is cellulose. So humans can't metabolize cellulose because we don't have the required enzymes to do so. However, bacteria in the colon are able to metabolize cellulose, and they can produce short-chain fatty acids from that cellulose. And these short-chain fatty acids are involved in a whole lot of different processes in the body. If you're really interested in gut bacteria, I did a bonus episode on it, so go listen to that. But essentially, these short-chain fatty acids are involved in cholesterol metabolism, lipogenesis. They may play a role in regulating appetite. They regulate gluconeogenesis, and they are the main source of energy for cells in the human colon. And the third primary function of the large intestine is in forming and moving feces toward the rectum for elimination. According to a paper called The Physiology of Human Defecation by Palit et al., it says that colonic mass movements in peristalsis move intestinal contents distally into the rectum. Rectal filling activates mechanoreceptors in the rectal walls, causing awareness of the need to defecate. As stool reaches the rectum, a small amount is allowed to pass through the anal cavity by an involuntary relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. This action, known as the recto-anal inhibitory reflex, is necessary for anal sampling, which is the process of determining if the rectal contents are of the gaseous, solid, or liquid form. And this is the reason why typically when you flatulate, you also don't defecate, which is a good thing. At this time, if defecation is not socially acceptable or convenient, the rectal wall relaxes and the need to defecate subsides temporarily. This is the point where if you are in a social setting, you may tell your friends or family or whoever you're with, "Excuse me while I perform a fecal evacuation." If it is a proper time to defecate, as is the case I just explained, the person generally either sits or squats depending on the environment, next contraction of the abdominal muscles, and performing the Valsalva maneuver while simultaneously relaxing the external anal sphincter and puborectalis muscle will expel feces from the body due to the pressure gradient generated between the rectum and anal canal. After fecal expulsion, the closing reflex occurs, which involves the external anal sphincter regaining its tone to maintain continence at rest. So this is all to say that the colon or the large intestine controls when fecal matter is expelled through a series of muscular contractions and a process that involves both involuntary control and voluntary control. And problems in the large intestine can actually be pretty serious. So I was talking to my mom, who is a wound care nurse, and she was talking about a patient whose colon had for some reason died. And I don't know exactly what that means, but the cells in the colon just were not functioning properly. And so this patient was unable to expel their own fecal matter. And so what this patient ended up doing for, I think, 10 years was they ended up giving themselves a weekly enema, where essentially they would put fluid up the anus and into the large intestine, and then they would lay on the floor of their bathroom and just kind of slosh around, and then it would all end up coming out as liquid because, the cells inside the colon were dead and the fecal matter was not able to be properly transported to the anus and then expelled. So that's not obviously a good life. And the reason my mom was taking care of this patient is because this patient eventually got an ileostomy, where they had a ostomy attached to their ileum. I believe it's essentially just a little hole where fecal matter can come out of their ileum instead of going into the large intestine. So I think she had her large intestine removed completely, and now fecal matter travels straight out of the ileum and into a bag that can be thrown away. And so all of this goes to point out that people can actually live without their large intestine. And why is that? Well, it's because, again, the majority of the absorption done in the digestive system occurs in the small intestine, and specifically in the jejunum. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about here is a little bit on the regulation of the digestive system. So there's several ways in which digestion is regulated. One of the ways is through hormones or through the endocrine system, and the other way is through nervous innervation. So numerous hormones help regulate the digestive system, and I just want to go through a few just to give you an idea of what some of these do. So gastrin is secreted by G cells in the stomach in response to the presence of proteins, and gastrin stimulates the release of hydrochloric acid by parietal cells, which again aids in the digestion and denaturation of proteins. Somatostatin is another hormone that is released, and it is released once the stomach is emptied, and this causes hydrochloric acid production to stop. Secretin stimulates release of bicarbonate into the duodenum to neutralize the acidic chyme that's coming into the duodenum from the stomach. Cholecystokinin, or CCK, stimulates the release of pancreatic juice. And again, pancreatic juice contains lots of proteolytic and lipase enzymes. And it also stimulates the release of bile from the gallbladder into the duodenum. So cholecystokinin is a very important hormone. In terms of nervous innervation, the autonomic nervous system plays a big role. So there is a branch of the autonomic nervous system known as the enteric nervous system, which is essentially the digestive system's own autonomic nervous network. And it actually functions completely independently of the central nervous system. In addition to the enteric nervous system, the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system also control different aspects of digestion. For example, the vagus nerve innervates the esophagus, stomach, pancreas, and upper large intestine, and it exerts parasympathetic control, which acts to stimulate different functions of the digestive system. In contrast to that, the splanchnic nerves innervate the stomach, liver, gallbladder, spleen, kidney, small intestine, and ascending and transverse colon. And they exert sympathetic control, which sends inhibitory signals to the digestive tract. So overall, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system stimulates some of the digestive processes, whereas the sympathetic branch exhibits inhibitory signals to the digestive system. And then the enteric nervous system, very complex. It controls many different things. For instance, it plays a role in digestive tract motility. And the last thing I'll mention here is that one way to control the digestive system is to control the opening and closing of these different sphincters, right? I talked about the pyloric sphincter. When it opens, material, chyme is released into the small intestine from the stomach. You can control all these other sphincters to control the movement of this material from one compartment to the other. And so I will mention that control of these sphincters is regulated both by hormones and by nervous innervation. And so I think the takeaway message here is that control of digestion is very complex, but it occurs through both hormones and nervous innervation. All All right, and that is it for the Digestive System podcast. I hope you found this helpful as you are studying for the MCAT. As always, if you like what we do, please go leave us a review on iTunes. It helps in the rankings. It helps us reach more students. Tell your friends who are studying for the MCAT. Just spread the word. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Prospective Doctor's MCAT podcast. If you're a pre-med, you'll want to check out prospectivedoctor.com for tons of free tools, articles, and more podcasts that cover your pre-med life. And if you need help on the MCAT or getting into med school, check out medschoolcoach.com for the experts.